Hello and welcome to the Days of Learning podcast. I'm your host, David Nelson, and I am thrilled to have my guest on the show today. Welcome, Drs. Jeff Whittle and Dr. Zeno Franco.
Good to see you, Dave.
Good to be here.
You know, this has been hard to schedule. You guys are pretty busy, so I've been looking forward to talking to you, but we had to schedule this from the summer. I know you guys are filled with your work around all of us and patient care, but I want to introduce both of you really quickly. Jeff Whittle is an internal medicine professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He does patient care at the Veterans Hospital here in Milwaukee. And Zeno Franco is a psychologist by training, but he is an associate professor of family and community medicine. And I frankly have gotten into trouble with both these guys on occasion or two. And I know they still work together and work hard to get into the community. I want to start with you, Jeff. I want you to just tell us about how you got to this point in your career. You can jump in at any time, but tell the audience a little bit about who you are.
Okay, so great. So I'm a Milwaukee native and went off to school in various places and ended up working as a faculty member in Pittsburgh. At that point, some of my research was focused on use of large databases that were sort of generated in the course of usual patient care. And about that time, some of the first studies came out that were showing that African Americans were much less likely to have cardiac bypass surgery or angioplasty than whites who had apparently similar diseases. And working within the VA at that time as well, I had pretty much assumed that it was a case of access to care, since we know that African Americans have worse access to care than whites. So I figured, well, in the VA that wouldn't happen because here, once you get through the door from eligibility, your access is pretty much the same. But when we looked at it, it turned out that the results were essentially exactly the same as had come from two different studies that were done in the private sector. And that sort of started an interest in racial differences in health and health care. I had done something similar with end-stage renal disease during my training, where one would think that the amount of end-stage renal disease would be similar in blacks and whites, but in fact, African Americans have, depending upon the place where you look, somewhere between 3 or 4, or even 8 times as likely to have end-stage renal disease. And that doesn't seem to be explained by differences in the amount of hypertension or diabetes. And so this interest in this kind of differences is really been interesting. And when we've tried to look at things like patient decision making or doctor decision making, which we've done and other doctors scientists have done as well, it's very hard to explain that. And part of the reason has been that the explanation is not simply a case of, oh, it's doctors are racist and that's what's causing it, or African Americans have a genetic predisposition to these conditions and that's what causes it. But it's actually a mixture of biology and environment and behaviors, both by patients and patient care providers. And that's really been a place where I've spent some time since that time, really focused on cardiovascular disease. And then when I moved to Kansas City to be in charge of their division of general medicine there, it turns out that the family medicine folks were a much more influential part of the University, Kansas University, than they had been at Pitt or at Hopkins or had been before. And so as the general medicine doctor, there are natural kind of colleagues. We take care of many of the same patients. And they introduced me to the idea of community-oriented primary care, which it was invented really by some people in Kansas. And that got me to say, it would be really good to work with the community on these problems. And shortly after that, I moved back to Milwaukee to be closer to home. And I've been very interested in working with the community to try to answer some of these scientific questions. It turns out that since I'm at the VA, the community that I've worked with the most is veterans, and in particular veterans organizations. And that in Milwaukee, it turns out skews pretty white. And so I haven't really had that much of my research since I've been here is focused on racial disparities and differences in healthcare. But then the All of Us research program came along and really promises to allow not really necessarily me, but make it possible for scientists to understand some of the differences that exist, and more importantly, really improve the quality of care for everybody, not sort of that it's specifically focused on underserved populations, although certainly it's important to the organization and important to my participation. that they do have a very broad outlook, but it really promises to, again, get to this idea of biology and behavior and environment and how they combine both to influence the healthcare treatment that people get, but also the healthcare outcomes, and really even the diseases that people get are driven by those factors. And so that's sort of where I got to here. And I continue to love to do patient care. That I was seeing patients 10 minutes ago, and I will be. I hope that actually give you one more anecdote. And so, during the time I was in Pittsburgh, there were two people that I always talk about when I talk about all of us. And so one was an older gentleman who I gave a statin to, and he ended up in the ICU with kidney failure. And that's because statins in a very small number of people cause the muscles to degenerate, and muscle breakdown products can cause kidney failure. And so I put that guy into renal failure, put him on dialysis. Very happily, he did recover, and so it didn't end up on dialysis, but for the long term. But he was dialyzed for months. And then another gentleman that I gave lisinopril, which is a drug that in a very small fraction of people causes swelling of the lips and mouth, and actually sometimes the swelling of the trachea, the breathing tube. And unfortunately, this is a guy who had this swelling of the breathing tube. So I gave him his medicine and got him on a life flight because his trachea closed off when he was somewhere far away from where I was giving care. And again, very fortunately, he was close by some emergency responders. He got basically an emergency tracheotomy. They basically stuck a knife into his throat in the field and opened up his airway. And he also recovered completely. But these were two people simply because I gave the wrong drug that interacted with their genetics and biology and actually could have killed them, even though on average, these are both great drugs. They save thousands of lives, prevent strokes, but you give them to the wrong people and they kill people. And so I would like to practice medicine where I have a little bit better idea of whether I'm going to give a drug that's going to help somebody or not help somebody. And again, precision medicine has that promise. It hasn't really entered my practice yet, but it has that promise. And again, that's how I'm here at All of Us.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that precision medicine. I want to take a step back because you know Zeno and I are not from this area. We've been here a long time, but not as long as you. Tell us about growing up in Milwaukee. What was
Yeah,
that like for you about where you grew up, and what
sure.
are some of your memories from that?
Yeah. So I don't want to have it be a whole long, long. Yeah, as you said, I was born here in Milwaukee at St. Mike's, which no longer exists. And we lived in North Lawn apartments. My dad was a
Mhm,
vet, and that was housing that was reserved for veterans. Interestingly, at that time, there were no African American folks there because even though now North Lawn is essentially 100% African American,
mhm,
and that reflects that at that point of time in Milwaukee, my dad, being a white vet, could get in, and the black vets didn't. And whether
mm,
that was still formally written in the law or if that was just something that happened because that's how people preferred it to be, is unclear. But that was basically the environment I grew up in. So really didn't know any black kids when I was a little kid. And then we moved to the north side near Good Hope and Tetonia,
mhm,
where I went to the Catholic school just down the block from there. And there were no black kids in my class, no black kids in my neighborhood. Now those areas are 100% African American.
yes.
While I was living there, there was a time when I couldn't go out after dark because a curfew was put in place because there were riots happening in downtown Milwaukee. So this is in the late 60s, shortly after the Chicago National Convention of the Democrats, where there was rioting in the streets there, mostly about the war, but the racial overtones in some ways very similar to how the COVID pandemic led to re-emphasis or re-examination of racial disparities today. Back then, the war was doing that, and it was a remarkable period of time. And I was totally oblivious. When you're 10 and 12 years
Mhm,
old, you don't know anything
mhm,
about this stuff.
mhm,
But it was really remarkable. And then when I went to Milwaukee Public Schools, finished Catholic grade school, but high school they made you pay. We didn't have any money, so I went to Milwaukee Public Schools, and suddenly there were black people there. And I played with them on the basketball court, and
mhm,
actually got in a fight with one guy one time. But so they were people. One of the kids that my brother, who was a year older, so went to school first, the kid from school that came to our house was African American, but it was unusual. And so I think that it's remarkable, or it's not remarkable to me how little understanding there is, because literally, I was, and then we moved, actually shortly thereafter, we moved to Whitefish Bay, also a very white area, and but you know a better school system at that time.
Mhm.
And again, so I really had very little interactions with people of color throughout my growing up, and all I heard about was either on TV or someplace else. So I'm not shocked at the differences in attitudes there are amongst people, because I, mostly would have had those same attitudes myself, and I'd say probably I still am not very sophisticated in terms of my interactions
Yes.
with people of color, I would say.
Well, I always appreciate when people give us some context, especially being a few years older than me. It really gives a centering of what's going on here in Milwaukee. Zeno, I'm going to bring you in now, having been a Los Angeles native and a little bit distant from myself and Jeff in terms of age. But talk about your journey to this point, about how you were a kid growing up in Los Angeles, and you suddenly find yourself in this Midwestern city called Milwaukee.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's a pleasure to be here. I think, it's been an interesting journey for sure. I mean, I came up also poor, in a mixed family. So my father was born in Mexico, came to the United States when he was 10, married a woman that was of Irish descent, in the Los Angeles basin. And, I came up in a divorced household and really thought of myself as, kind of being just a kid. I think when I was in high school, I was actually put into a minority student program that was designed to make sure that minority students got into college. And I really didn't understand why I had been diverted into this program. It really wasn't until years later where I understood like what they were trying to do, and trying to kind of create that pathway for folks like me. But I think because I often look and am perceived as being white, people just kind of make assumptions that that's kind of the background. And I really, like I said, I really didn't see the point at the time. But then when you look at some of the different factors, I really didn't have the social capital needed to understand how to kind of navigate the college process. And they were trying to impart that early on. So I went to junior college for 2 years. I had been just kind of an average student in high school. Started performing pretty well in junior college, and then went over to the University of California system for undergrad in psychology. Got really focused on doing research and also interested in clinical care, and went to Northern California for graduate school eventually. In between, I spent about 5 years as a research technologist for the University of California, Riverside. So I have a very strong kind of interest in technology. My wife and I moved to Northern California, did a PhD in clinical psychology. A lot of my clinical rotations were also in the VA system, so in the Palo Alto VA healthcare system, primarily at the Menlo Park campus, where they have a very large residential program for veterans who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the first women's PTSD residential programs was located there. So I got to see some really interesting, innovative, I would say, clinical care on the psychology side. At the same time, I was also very interested in kind of addressing trauma in mass disaster situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I took a doctoral fellowship in, with the Department of Homeland Security for 3 years. So I have a kind of strong interest in how crises unfold, and thinking kind of through some of that stuff, which has actually been useful in the current context with COVID. I wasn't expecting to have to apply it in a pandemic situation, but a lot of the sort of learning that came from that process, thinking through how multiple agencies respond to disasters, has been useful, actually on the medical side and the community engagement side. Came to Milwaukee to follow my wife. She had gotten an appointment here at UW Milwaukee in the School of Education, actually in Community Studies Department. She has a lot of experience in California doing traditional community-based participatory research. And so I actually learned to do CBPR in some senses, community outreach and engagement, really watching her interface with largely immigrant communities, Mexican immigrant communities in the California area, both in Southern California and in Northern Cal. So just kind of watching that process and thinking about it, actually thinking about disaster stuff really got me to start to think about prevention more. And psychology does not a very good job of thinking about preventing psychological trauma. They usually think about just, okay, somebody's been exposed to trauma and how do we treat it? And so I did my final internship year here at the Milwaukee VA, actually met Jeff there. Discussing some community outreach programs in the veteran space that were of mutual interest. And Jeff and I have worked together as a result for the last 10 plus years. As you know, came onto a postdoc here at the medical college and really got some formal training in community engagement. So it sort of was a nice segue from sort of watching it being done by my significant other in the field to actually getting some theoretical training in the space. And I've been really, interested in sort of applying some of those things to communities that I do think are left out of the health system, or more broadly of some of the social services that are important to ensure that we have a healthy community. I think one of the most powerful learnings that I took was, that we're only as strong as the weakest link in our community. And we often think about, well, it's not me, I don't have to worry about it. Well, if somebody is sick, I think COVID-19 is a great example of that. We have Hispanic and African American and essential workers out there who are taking care of making sure that we're fed, and things are being done in the region to make sure that people can stay working, have their household running. But that means some people are exposed differentially. And we're seeing that, that's what happened early on in the north side in the city. And right now on the south side, we have some pretty significant hotspots with COVID. And so just thinking about how do we keep an entire community healthy has been a big push for me over the last few years.
I want to ask you, Zeno, because Jeff brought this up from his upbringing, and I want to bring it back to you. You and I have talked about one of those sentinel moments in your life was the 1991 riots in Los Angeles. What are some of your memories of that as it relates to what's going on today and the polarization of the issues around race, equity, and the political nature of things?
Yeah. I think the Rodney King riots were definitely a touchstone for folks from my generation and from that location. So I was living, by that time, I was living about 60 miles due east of Los Angeles. But the impact of the riots was felt through the entire Los Angeles basin. It was a very tense few days. And, I had lived as a kid not that far from some of what happened. And so it was very personal in that sense. I think watching the videotape of the police beating was just, it's just hard to watch, right? No one who's not resisting arrest deserves that kind of beating. And there are strategies for de-escalating that are often not used. Not to make it overly, about Milwaukee, but I was also at the Red Arrow Park right after the shooting happened there. Within minutes of that shooting having taken place, I saw the cleanup happening from it. And I don't know all the details, but I think as best as we can figure out, that's a situation that could have been de-escalated with somebody that was having a significant mental health problem. And I think, the police do a really important job, right? We need people to keep our city safe and to deal with crime and all those things. And I think the police here in Milwaukee are the first to say they don't have the training for dealing with mental health issues. One of the lead officers pointed that out after Red Arrow, and it was very poignant actually to listen to him say we don't have sufficient training to deal with some of these situations. And that they want that actually, right? And so I think with the Rodney King situation, it got out of hand with the police. The net result of that was a set of civil unrest. I don't really like to call it riots because I think, you know, that's an easy way to make it okay to look at it just from one perspective. The net result though was about $800 million in damage and you know, something like 60 deaths in exactly the neighborhoods that could least afford the damage. And that's what hurt, I think. And so from that, I think, you know, one of the things that I've taken actually was Rodney King's words at the end of that. When he saw the amount of damage that was being done to his own city, he finally just came forward and said, can't we all just get along? And I think that's the crux of it, is trying to work toward a situation where we're all collectively working to make things as reasonably good as we can in a city. There's always going to be some issues, right? We can't solve everything today. But Milwaukee is an incredibly segregated city. It has been for generations. And I think if I can, after living here for 10 years, I'm going to push us a little bit and just say, I think it's partially a failure of imagination about what a more optimal city could look like. And I think the COVID situation, because we're working very differently in this with the city, with the county, with the medical school, with the different response agencies, there's a glimmer of maybe if we all these different agencies thought together about how to address some of these problems, we could end up in a different spot. We could end up with a different looking city in 25 years or 50 years where people are more equal. And that's not to take away, there's always going to be some people that are, you know, far and away richer, more, you know, benefiting from the you know, ability to be entrepreneurs differentially, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that we can afford actually to leave the poorest folks behind in the process.
I appreciate you saying that, and I always learn something new when I interview my guests, and I've known both of you for a long time. And Jeff spoke of the right medicine, the idea of precision medicine, the right medicine for the right person at the right time. And you're really talking something similar around prevention of trauma and disaster and the psychology that goes with it. And I think that's sometimes what makes a really cool partnership, when you have different disciplines coming together around the same idea and ideals in order to make a place and a country healthier for all people. I want to get into this because we could spend a whole hour on equity, which I think is an important topic. But I really do want to tie it to this idea of all of us and how we make decisions around the right medicine, or how medicines are even thought of in the first place. Jeff, I want to start with you to have you talk about the All of Us project, what it is, and how you became involved. And Zeno, if you want to add things to it, I think it's a good juxtaposition of the two of you and the spaces that you're in. Jeff, can I start with you? Can you tell us about All of Us?
Okay, so the All of Us research program is an effort to build an incredibly useful scientific database to answer questions about how biology, environment, and behavior interact to generate both health and health outcomes, and to some extent, health care. And when I say, and the way that that is being built is by getting a representative, not even representative, a diverse population from across the country, so that you have different types of people, but also different types of environments, to provide information about their personal environment, their personal behavior, and then basically both information, but then also bodily materials that tell us about their biology, and then linking that to their health care and their records of their health outcomes. And so all of us will have a database of 1 million people, very diverse population, about which we'll know a great deal at the time that they start the program, but then over time, because we will continue to have access to their health care and health outcomes, we'll know more and more about how that information could be used to influence their health care and their health. And the data is collected and made available to scientists all over the country and actually all over the world, so that the scientists can work together on the same set of data and build on each other's expertise. And so it's creating the database and then creating a space where various scientists and they can be social scientists, people who have no interest in medicine at all. They can be doctors who are clinical doctors like myself, or they can be people who are basic students of, of cells and genes and things that have nothing, well, that you really can't see the connection between people and them, but they can study that very basic biology. So all sorts of different people can work on it. And because they're working with a common data, and because the results of their studies and tests go back into that database, it becomes a progressively more and more useful data set over time. So that's the vision. And the way we're doing it is by going person by person.
Zeno, Jeff mentioned this idea of diverse people and diverse environments. Why is that so important in this idea of studying issues related to the community?
Absolutely, David. So I think, one thing just to say first off is I'm not a geneticist. So, I think I can point to some of the potential areas where there's important things to consider. But I think that's also a place for deeper conversations kind of with a precision medicine experts over time. But just to give some sense of it, so I was working with Walnut Way, which is a agency on the north side that serves largely African American audience. And I was invited to be part of their research council. And I served on that council for a couple of years, really talking with community members about the importance of research, what types of information is produced by research, relevance to health, and so on. And I think, one of the things that struck me is that there were some women on that council that were in perfect health, apparently, when I started. And within the 2 or 3 years that I was coming to those meetings, their health had taken a turn for the worse. And when that happened, their health declined dramatically and rapidly. And I think, one of the things that is apparent in the literature is not just that there are health differences, but there are differences in health trajectory. Based on the different racial groups or ethnic groups that we have. And so it's often the case that people get sicker faster from some of the minority communities that we serve. So that's one component. I think another thing that really struck me is one day I was talking to some collaborators at the public health department, and they had posters up talking about differences in exposure to toxic things in our environment in Milwaukee, in the city, based on zip code. And those discussions were very deep. I mean, they knew things about people's houses that are personal, right? If there's a rat infestation, if there's insects in the home, if there's lead in the walls. And we have a legacy here in Milwaukee of very complex chemical exposures in different regions of the city based on when the housing stock was built, and who has populated those homes. There are differences based on the types of employment that people have had. So asbestos exposure for people that were working in some of the factories, differences in chemical exposure based on that work. This is an incredibly complex industrial city, right? With a deep history. And those exposures actually, we know, create not just changes in sort of our general health, but they can also impact the way our genes are expressed. And it's a very complex interaction between the environment and our genetic structure that can then cause diseases to be expressed differently based on those exposures. And so, in some of the discussions with folks on that research council at Walnut Way, I think there's a growing understanding in the younger minority community that these differences in exposure, can have long-lasting implications in people's health and health trajectory. And there's I think, a hunger for an understanding of what that means. And so I think for me, one of the things about the All of Us program is also, one, doing the research, getting the genetic information, gathering the electronic health record information that we're charged with, but also really talking with the community about where the future of this precision medicine effort is going to go, so they understand how important this gathering this type of information, the combination of environmental, genetic, and health outcome data is.
You know, that's you sound a little bit like a geneticist, so I'm going to give you credit for that. Um, Jeff, I want to get into the weeds a little bit, as we're
Yeah.
often do, and this show is about how medicine works and how medicine connects to the community. You talked about those cases where you prescribed a medicine that you thought was the right one and it had detrimental effects to your patient. Talk to us about this idea of precision medicine, what it is and how it works.
Okay, so when the precision medicine first came out, I think what struck me, and in a negative way, was that they said, well, we are going to now tailor treatments to the needs of individuals, taking into account their behaviors and their environment. And it suggested that I wasn't doing that already, right? That's why I spent a bunch of years in medical school and training, is to learn how to tailor treatments to people. So I didn't just give this guy the statin because, oh, his cholesterol was high. He had coronary disease, and there were reasons why he needed it, and somebody else with some other things might not need it. And the same thing with the choice of blood pressure medicines. When I gave the gentleman the drug that caused him to have problems. But what precision medicine is going to do is going to just take that up an entirely different level. So you've heard this is a zip code determines more than the genetic code. That's a common saying. I have never used a person's zip code in their management. I haven't used it to adjust my screening behaviors. I might indirectly, as I get to know people, make allowances for what their environment is like, and as we strategize that, especially as the patient gets to know me a little better, we share information about the barriers that they're living in. But the ability to incorporate the environment in a more kind of thoroughgoing way, a way that really sort of lets people know about the risks that are associated with being where they live, may not be something I can necessarily fix, and that may be why it hasn't been used as much. But knowing about that environment will be very helpful, and then on top of it, knowing genetic information and how it might interact with that environment is also really important. So Zeno makes reference to chemical exposures, and clearly there are people that worked in uranium factories all their life and never have any problems with cancer at all. There are people that were at Hiroshima that never developed leukemia. But it is the case that their genetics interacted with an environmental exposure that, had the doctors known who was going to have adverse events from this or that, they could do a heck of a lot better job. And so it's just precision medicine is going to allow me to be more precise. It's not that doctors don't try to tailor already, but you'll just have a big leg up on that process.
Do you have an example that you could give the audience of
So I
where
think,
that may come out?
yeah. So I think so the specific drugs that I mentioned, the statins and the ACE inhibitors, both have, for example, the risk of having that reaction where the guy's trachea swelled up is more common in the African American population. Almost certainly, there's something genetic that's driving that, because right, we know that it's not the color of your skin that determines how you respond to this, but there are genetic associations that are more common in the African American population that probably lead to that. That's my guess. We haven't actually identified that yet, so I'm a little surprised actually that hasn't happened. And the same thing with the statins. There are groups that have more of an impact depending upon how they metabolize the statins. And in there actually is some genetic data about how to find people who are going to have more adverse reactions. But what we don't have is a great way of incorporating that into practice, in part because genetic tests are not commonly done, but in part because not everybody, again, it's seldom, we think about things like sickle cell and cystic fibrosis where the gene causes the disease. That's an incredibly small minority of genetically affected diseases. The vast majority are like the statin example, where the gene puts you at a little bit higher risk, but there may be people who have enough other factors that suggest they're not at risk, that it's still worth using it, or enough factors that suggest they really benefit a lot from the statins that make it important. So that ability to integrate that data is going to become a huge part of practice. And all of us is not just about, collecting a bunch of genes and saying that gene X causes disease Y. It's also about figuring out, well, how do you use that data? How do you integrate that? Because it's not something I keep in my head. There's 25,000 genes and 3 billion base pairs in your genome. And I can't keep 3 billion things in mind that easily. And when you integrate it with other things, it's impossible. So how are we going to get the computational support into my clinic so that when I look at the computer, it's going to help me with those decisions? It's a complex process. So precision medicine is not going to, I'm not going to provide better care tomorrow across the spectrum of precision medicine, but within 5 years, I'm not going to give anybody statins that I don't know for sure what their risk is, and I can't give them a lot better guidance than I give now. And that'll be a very, very near-term consequence. We will do a much better job of prescribing before I retire.
That's very exciting.
And I'm
Zeno, I
61.
want to bring you back in, Zeno, because I want to ask this and I want to get your opinion on this. I want to stretch you a little bit to say, he's talking about this interaction, the genetics and the environment. And somebody mentioned, I think Jeff mentioned this idea of behaviors. How can all of us in what you're studying around this complexity of life, how do behaviors play into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of the simple things, right, is, just the basics, right? What do we eat and how much exercise do we get? And what impact does that have on our overall health? Has been a, area of research and trying to actually change health behaviors for many, many years. I think the difference with all of us is that now we're also going to potentially be able to see the impact those health behaviors have on the genome. And so, there are things that we probably didn't understand that well 20 or 30 years ago about epigenetic expression, phenotypic expression. So, there are ways in which the genome can change based on some of these exposures, right? Whether it's on the negative side, if you want to think about it that way, right, with the toxic exposure that can damage the genes, and then the genes are expressed differently over time. We think that there may be also some what we call salutogenic effects, right? Health giving effects from some positive health behaviors as well. And so I think that's an interesting area of thinking about what, we often think about sort of the negative in medicine, right? We're worried about these different diseases. If we really understand what health behaviors are the most important to protect health, how that can protect the genome, I think that gives us better insight into how to talk with people about the relevance of these health behaviors over time. And so that's, I think, a key point, right? And you start to think about how that interacts in different populations as well. We just, I think we're at the cusp of really knowing some things that can help us on the prevention side with this as well.
Well, you bring a good point as I have studied health behaviors, and this show is also about wellness. So what you're saying is some of these health-giving behaviors we may be able to prescribe depending on the person's genomics as well as where they live. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeff is probably in a better position to answer that. But I think that's the promise of this is that we will have a better understanding, right? So I think I'm learning too as a researcher involved in this program, right? All of us is a huge effort. It's a national effort. There's all different specialties at the table trying to make it happen. And I think, one of the things that was really impressive to me is understanding that diabetes, for example, isn't a unitary disease. It's an umbrella description of probably 5 or 6 different disease processes that occur in slightly different ways across different folks. I think one of the other things that was really fascinating for me is seeing that diabetes occurs at lower BMI and at an earlier age in ethnic minorities, right? And looking at the hard data from a research study that shows this. And as a Hispanic man, I have to worry about it too, right? My uncle has diabetes. My father has some serious health issues. And so you're just sort of sitting here thinking, what can I do to help myself? And so, I think it's going to draw clearer conclusions between health behaviors, genetics, and outcomes over time that are going to be important. And the downside too of not taking advantage of some of those positive health behaviors will become clearer as well. I think one of the things that that Jeff was pointing to as well, right? And I think this is an important thing. The implications from all of us may not impact my care, right? They likely won't. but my kids also carried the genetic structures of myself, my parents, my wife's parents, and those differences in how we metabolize things are there in those children. And so I'm actually trying to take a very long-term view of this, right? Is that we're trying to invest in the health of our kids and our grandkids, and frankly, their grandkids. The All of Us program, from my perspective, is so large and it's such a big effort. The type of data that it's collecting is so important and so complex that the understandings that come from it probably are going to take 25, maybe 50 years to really unpack. And that's an investment in the future.
You know, that's a little bit hard to imagine. And in this day and age of instant gratification, it's hard to sometimes imagine about great grandchildren benefiting from this program. I am an All of Us participant. I am one of those gene pools that are in there. Jeff, can you tell us how it works? Tell our audience, this All of Us, what happens? Say somebody wants to be a part of this. What do they get to do?
Yeah. Okay. So this is very much logistics. So basically, there is the All of Us program has set up a website, the Join All of Us, all one word, .org, where people go and they basically first say, okay, I think I'm interested, and can read about it. And if they say I'm still kind of interested, they can put their name in and then register. So they got an email and a name, and at that point, that now you're registered, and then you can, if you want to, then you'll get a call or an email from the All of Us folks saying, hey, sounds like you're interested. Anything we can do for you? You want to talk to somebody? Or you can actually don't even wait for anything and just go ahead, start saying, yeah, I've read enough. I heard David Nelson endorse it. It's good enough for David. It's good enough for me. So they can start to put their name, their contact information, a little bit about themselves into a website, agree, consent to participate in research. And that might be plenty for some people. They feel like they're part of it. They are now an All of Us participant. Um, but then there's limited things we can do that. We can describe people with that information, but it'd be really nice if they could also let us look at their electronic health record. So they might then say, oh, well, I'm willing to share that. I mean, I think that people are really going to be able to learn about my health really best if they see what the doctors have, the tests that I've had done and what the doctors say. And at this stage, and even before then, you start to get some information back. So if you've done a bunch of surveys and you want to see what your responses look like compared to other people, you can kind of look and see, oh, this is the other surveys. You can go and look and see, well, what kind of studies are being done? Well, it turns out you can look at that. And so now people who are in the All of Us program are learning a little bit about the research that's being done. They're seeing how they compare to other people participating in the survey. They're are all the people as young as I am? Or, they can look at that kind of thing. And then the last step is to say, I think that I would be really interested to see how my biologic health or my biologic information impacts my health. So I'm going to actually give them blood and urine. They can see from the blood, my genetics, but also not just my genetics, the things that is in your nucleus that we think of as a gene test, but also the genes that are floating around free in your blood. And people have sort of heard about, oh, there's a test in the blood for cancer. Well, that's kind of where that's coming from. Changes in the genetics fragments from cancer cells being broken down. Maybe those could be found in the blood and we could do something. Pie in the sky right now, but all of us may make that more possible. We're gathering data about people's RNA that are floating around free in the blood. We have samples that will allow people to look at metabolic products that we really don't know what their clinical use is, but maybe they are clinically very useful. So actually we collect 8 tubes of blood. They're stored in different ways because we do different things with them, but it's a chance to really learn a ton about people's biology. And then the urine tells us things about exposures that we wouldn't be able to know otherwise. Just with the Milwaukee example, we'll eventually, I'm sure we'll be testing how much lead is in your urine, which will give us a sense of what you've been drinking. So I think that all of those things happen, and that can happen as fast as somebody hearing this, going online and going and giving their blood sample. I would say tomorrow under ordinary circumstances, but with the pandemic, we're not meeting people face to face to capture blood for research. So it will be several months before somebody could actually do their blood, but they could give answer the surveys and give access to electronic health records, within an hour after the show is over. So it's a pretty it's in some ways it's an easy study, but it's in some ways it's a challenging study because we're asking people to tell me, fairly private information about their health behaviors. Give us access to your health records.
Mhm.
And so it's probably not for everybody, but for those who are interested, it's a relatively easy lift to get through the process if you're computer savvy. If you're not, then you may be better off working directly with one of our staff on the line, kind of walking you through it.
Well, I did both, and it was a time pre-pandemic, and it was easy. The staff were wonderful, and they walked me right through. And I did all of the things that were asked, and I've even done some additional ones when I've gotten the notification. You guys even sent me a birthday card, which is pretty cool. You guys didn't sign it, but you sent me a birthday card, which is really awesome. Zeno, I want to ask this question to you because Jeff had mentioned the idea of diversity, and I know you've worked a lot in community engagement. How is diversity and equity an important part of this All of Us initiative?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, David. One of the problems that's been there with all biomedical research in a way, but especially I think with genetic research, is that most of the research that's been performed has kind of been done on what we would think about as sort of a normative patient, probably a white middle-aged male. And that creates problems just in regular terms, right? So like sometimes we're prescribing, physicians might be prescribing a medication that's really based on that sort of male profile. And so that's actually caused problems with prescribing to women, right? And so by not including women in some of these studies, we've kind of missed the mark with that stuff. The same thing has happened in terms of inclusion of Hispanic, African American, Southeast Asian, Native American. We can go through all the different sort of demographic categories that have been harder to engage in research in one way, maybe because the relevance hasn't been clear. For some of the communities, there's been some negative history of research, which we're all very aware of, but it's continuing to be difficult to build trust around such a, like Jeff was saying, this is, we're asking for some pretty private information. I think when we started talking with some of our external partners, though, in the minority communities across the city, one of the things that became very clear to me is they understand, I think there's a shift in understanding that unless our minority communities participate, we're going to continue to have this problem of only having data from sort of this normative patient, right? And that we're not going to understand the variation in different types of patients as well as we could. And that's going to continue to cause us problems. And so all of us has really made an effort. The name itself says we're trying to include all of us, every different person from different backgrounds across the entire United States, 1 million people from very, very different backgrounds, different ability levels, different sexual orientation, transgender, minority groups, majority groups. It doesn't matter. Come as you are, participate in research, be heard through your genes, really, right? And I think that the community partners that we're talking to really want to be sure that there is representation across the entire city in this data set, so that we kind of solve for that problem. I'll tell you one story that I thought was particularly powerful when we were talking in the African American community about this. I was standing in the parking lot of a church trying to describe what all of us was, and talking with a older African American woman and describing the genetics aspect of the study. And she asked me, will I get to learn more about myself through this study? And we haven't gotten all the logistics worked out for this, but eventually all of us will be able to return genetic information that helps the participant understand if they're at risk for certain factors, and likely if they're, what their different backgrounds are from more of an ancestry perspective. And she told me that she didn't know where she came from in Africa, that her family's history had been erased in the process of slavery. And that they were making guesses based on facial structure, based on the little fragments of stories that they had. But I think that one of the most powerful aspects of this is that it can give us insight into our own personal background. And so, that's a restorative piece around equity that I think is really, really crucial.
That's beautiful because I made these notes about equity, inclusion, building trust, and I actually added justice. Jeff, why is this important to what Zeno is talking about? This idea of going out and talking with community partners and people about the study.
I think it's, you have this legacy of distrust, and I would say, you know, it's many people that I know who are white veterans, have are aware of research being done that is not for the benefit of the study participant. They refer to themselves as guinea pigs. They understand that, and right, we had the atomic veterans that were exposed. And I think that for populations of color, oftentimes it's been particularly egregious, and I think ongoing. So it's not like it sort of stopped, right? We know Tuskegee stopped in the 70s. In the 70s, I was like in high school, and it wasn't even a big deal when somebody finally said, "Oh, maybe we should stop this." I would have thought there'd have been like some sort of a national, today, at the time I didn't even know it existed, but I said this happened in the 70s. Henrietta Lacks, she died in the 50s, and the cells have been used for just an incredible amount of time. And I was at Hopkins. The scientists that harvested those cells, some were still working there. They were incredibly well-respected researchers, and they were very good people who were doing very good research. But it just was totally ignored that there were people who had participated in that research, who had contributed to that research in a way more than anybody else, that weren't even in the conversation. So I think that it's just incumbent upon us to go out and hear the stories. And I think that I can't fix the story. I can't make it not true. But I think there is some benefit of going out there and having people yell at me about the fact that they feel been treated poorly. And I think, you know, one of the things that's challenging I know for both Zeno and I, is that we can't go out there and give them a guarantee. Oh, well, once we figure out how to deliver this new precision medicine, you'll have good access to care too, because you participate in the study. No, that's a different social problem. And that's one that we can promise that we're going to work with the community to try to make sure access to care and access to precision medicine is broadly available. But that's something that the American contract has to still, they haven't written that check very well yet. So I think that it's an ongoing issue. So I think that having that connection, that they could at least say, no, no. So Jeff Whittle said he would work on that, and some belief that that will happen. But we have to be honest in terms of timeframes and things like that. As the president said, right, the arc of history is a long one. President Obama, I mean, and it bends towards justice, but it doesn't mean it's an arrow going straight towards justice. And I think that that's kind of where we are.
I appreciate both of you saying that. I am so fired up. I want to sign up again, but I can't. I just want to go out and do my part for justice and sign up again. But Jeff, how do people get involved? Where do they go? Give us some information, because people will listen to this.
Okay, so certainly we know www.joinallofus.org will get us the first step. And then the next step is to send an email to all of us, all one word, at mcw.edu, and say, hey, I want to sign up. Will somebody help me? And then I hesitate to use the phone because, again, we have people in and out of the phone. But for some people, the phone is just the way that they do it. So it's MCW standard 41 air code 414955 A of U, so 2638. The phone number. So I think that there are multiple different ways to get into it and learn more about it. But the website is, if you're computer savvy or if you have a family member who is, you can really learn a lot of interesting things about it. And then the other thing is to talk to people. So there are members of the community who are on our community advisory board. And I don't know if I should be giving out names, but because maybe they don't want a lot of people to call them. But members of the community have really done a lot to help us to tailor our messaging and to make sure that we're reaching out to the the appropriate population. Certainly the federally qualified health center leadership, each of them is well aware of all of us, and they would be a place to ask. Not everybody who works at these federally qualified health centers knows all of us, but they are all aware. The instant organizations are aware. Social Development Commission leadership is aware of this. Many of the churches, in particular the General Baptist State Convention, but churches all across the Catholic churches and Baptist churches and Lutheran churches, all of them have had exposure, Kojic churches, to all of us. And so there are folks who are in the community that know, but I think that since we've not been effective in reaching every single person, I'd say the place to go is probably still to the medical college and to the website that I've listed.
Got it. All of this, we'll send people to the www.joinallofus.org as all of this show shows up on the internet, and everybody who gets the show will be computer savvy, and there will be multiple ways to do this. Since it is Veterans Day, and this show will air after Veterans Day, I want to get some sense from both of you, because you both work with veterans groups. I'd love to hear some of the memories that you care with me. I want to start with you, Zeno. What are some of the memories that stand out in your mind about your work with veterans?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stories. So I worked when I was interning at the VA. I worked a lot with Vietnam combat theater veterans who had seen just an incredible amount of combat, and kind of living with those stories. I actually think the tornado alarm has gone off here. So, you know, I think living with those stories has been an interesting process. You know, I worked with a man who had his unit had been cited for heroics, and he really felt like he was not a hero because he was so afraid during some of his deployment. And just kind of working through that experience, working through the fear of the different things that he had seen. He had been in hand-to-hand combat with Viet Cong. It's incredibly powerful stuff. Some of the things that he told me about visceral experiences that he had had. You know, I walked out of some of the sessions not able to eat because of the description of how bad some of the combat had been, and what he had seen, torture, atrocities, all sorts of things. I think the American people often forget how much veterans have seen in their deployments. And so, you know, here in Milwaukee, I've had the honor of really not just treating veterans, but kind of, because I'm more in the community engagement side at this point, really walking in a sense through life with them, talking about the different experiences that they're going through as they reintegrate into civilian life, and have been working a lot more, I would say, with younger veterans that were in Afghanistan and Iraq, and seeing their transitions. I mean, there's a couple of the guys that I've worked with. This is not in a clinical sense, so I can use their names, Tom Voss, and I'm trying to think what the other guy's name was.
His walking partner.
Yeah, the walking partner. So, you know, I just saw him on Facebook, the partner, and, you know, he was really struggling just a couple years ago with kind of reintegration, and now he's running a small company up north. I think, you know, doing stuff on beards, and you know, they're shipping stuff all over, and he's got a beautiful baby, and you know, he's gone from being overweight and kind of struggling to being incredibly fit and back on his feet. And I think, you know, that's been a very powerful journey, is just watching these young men come back into themselves after military service.
I know that you walk with them diligently and intently, and so we thank you for doing so, Dr. Franco. Jeff, tell us about you've treated a lot of veterans in your career. What name a memory that stands out for you in this space?
Yeah, so I guess I don't know if it's in this space, but in terms of the service that veterans provide, I think that what really has always struck me was that I would go to work at a clinic, and typically, and from the time I was in training, I would be running around seeing patients in clinic, and we worked fairly hard, see a lot of people, and I by nature am kind of present as always being in a hurry, and all these vets would be concerned about my well-being, that I was working too hard, and they were oftentimes from the generation where many of their kids had, gotten into trouble with behavioral things, and so they were still working because the Milwaukee had gone through basically the Rust Belt syndrome, and so they were not employed at their previous, relatively well-paying union job, but they couldn't get by with what they had, so they were working a 40-hour-week job. They were actually taking care of their grandchildren because their kid had turned out to be a deadbeat and was not taking care of them. And so they were working probably 40, 60 hours, not very well off, were incredibly skillful. So they would also help their friends and neighbors to, add an addition onto their house or put up the drywall and take care of their grandkids. And they were worried that I was working too hard. And, and it was just always amazing to me how much they thought about other people. And I have to imagine that's part of why most of them had volunteered for their service, and then to end up in the situations that Zeno talked about. They knew that could happen, and they did sign up, and I think they almost always are proud of their service, although they may not have been happy with some of the things that ended up happening during their service. But they all, I think, recognize that they made a great sacrifice for their country, and and I think the vast majority would do it again. So I think that's what strikes me, is just how service oriented they are.
Thank you for that story. And I know that you are often in a hurry, but you're often in a hurry to care for the next veteran. So thank you for caring for the veterans. Wow, this has gone by incredibly fast. Is there anything else that either of you want to share with our listeners at this time?
The only last thing I wanted to say, David, is the veteran that I was thinking of is his name is Anthony Anderson. So him and Tom Voss walked across the entire United States just to bring attention to veterans issues. And like I said, he's
We
doing
give a shout out to Anthony and Tom. Thank you,
Yep.
Zeno, for
Yep,
remembering
absolutely. Thanks for having us on, David.
that. It is my pleasure. Dr. Whittle, anything else that you want to add at this time?
No, I think this has been a lot of fun. You told me that it would be, and you're correct. And actually, having watched the other shows, I would have to say this is kind of a view on health that is a really important one, that I commend your podcast to your viewers.
Oh, thank you for saying so. You know what? I just love comments like that because it makes me want to have you come back to give you more comments like that. Would you both come back in the future? Because I want to have a show on veteran health and this idea of heroism. I think it's important, and it's a way for us to communicate to the public just how important our veterans are. So I hope you guys, it wasn't so painful, that you will come back in the future.
Absolutely.
We'd always come back to talk about the vets. Yeah.
Right on.
Thanks, David.
Dr. Zeno Franco, Dr. Jeff Whittle, from the All of Us Initiative, from the Days of Learning podcast, I'm your host, David Nelson. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks a lot, David. Take care.
What a powerful set of messages that were given to us today by Drs. Franco and Whittle. They talked about this idea of a community-oriented primary care at the beginning, and how issues that are seemingly everyday, like taking care of people with diabetes and hypertension, can have potentially disastrous effect if they're given the wrong medicine, and how giving the right medicine at the right time from a precision medicine perspective really does matter. And they both spoke of this idea deeply about equity and justice and inclusion, which is often forgot about when we talk about how medicines are developed. The idea of diversity and equity and justice are important to this show. And I was just thrilled that the All of Us program is out there and trying to do its part around precision medicine and creating a more just world. If you're interested in becoming part of all of us, you can go to www.joinallofus.org. Thank you for listening to us. Drop us a note, sign up for the podcast. We are now on Apple Podcast. We are also on Spotify, and you can find us at our Days of Learning YouTube channel. For Days of Learning, I am your host, David Nelson. Thank you for joining us, and continued health and wellness to you and yours.